is the Happy Scientist Podcast. Each episode is designed to make you more focused, more productive, and more satisfied in the lab. You can find us online at bitesizebio.com/happy scientist. Your hosts are Kenneth Vogt, founder of the executive coaching firm Vera Claritas, and Dr. Nick Oswald, PhD, bioscientist, and founder of Bitesize Bio.
Hello, everyone. This is Kenneth Vogt for the Happy Scientist. We're so delighted to be with you today, and we've got a very interesting interview today with someone who's done a study that I don't know where they came up with this idea, but it's such a great idea, and I hope you think so too. So allow me to introduce our guest today is Dr. Brandon Vaidyanathan, and he is an associate professor at Catholic University of America. Brandon, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Kenneth. Good to be here.
Great. I wonder if you'd like, you could give a bit of a potted bio or anything else you'd like to add to who you are.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm a professor of sociology, associate professor of sociology at Catholic University, as you mentioned. My area of research is mainly in organizational culture. So I've looked at how cultures shape human flourishing broadly in business, in religion, and in science. So those are the three sectors that I study. And the work we're going to talk about today is part of that research on scientists.
All right. So that being said, we're gonna be talking about a study that you've recently done. What's the title of your study?
It's called Work and Well-Being in Science.
All right. And it focuses to a large extent also on the impact of beauty and when it comes to wellness for scientists. So let's just start with that. Beauty is not something that at least the outside world often thinks of when they think of science, but that is probably not the case for scientists. Scientists probably see a lot of beauty. So it does lead to a question: what does beauty mean to a scientist? How are they seeing beauty in their work?
Yeah, it's you're right. I mean, a lot of people on the outside seem puzzled when I tell them that I'm studying beauty and science. They don't see those words going together at all, right? I think we have a stereotype of scientists as being cold and dispassionate and socially awkward and unemotional.
Apparently, they haven't met many scientists.
Yeah, no, really, I think that's really the stereotype we're trying to dispel. So we found actually I can tell you a little bit about how this started, because a number of years ago, I was doing another massive international study of scientists, and I was on a team with a number of other sociologists, and we were looking at the social context of science, everything from family life, ethics, religion, those sorts of things. And at the end of these long interviews, we did about 600 interviews. Towards the end of the interviews, we heard scientists telling us about the many sacrifices they were making for the sake of their work. They're giving up their sometimes their health, sometimes prestigious jobs in industry, etc. We were mainly studying academic scientists, bench scientists, and we asked them, "Why do you do it then?" A lot of them would say, "Because it's beautiful." And so I was really struck by the use of that word. It kept coming up so often. So I really wanted to understand, well, what do they mean by this word? And so it means different things to scientists in different fields. I study physicists and biologists, and there's some commonalities and some differences. And so we find that there aren't an infinite number of things. So people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not exactly true. We find that in those initial interviews we did, we were asking hundreds of scientists, what do you encounter beauty in your work, and what does that mean to you? We found that it only came to about 8 or 10 things. They were always talking about symmetry or simplicity or elegance or a sense of harmony or a sense of fit or the hidden order or the inner logic of systems. And so it was a range of things that kept coming up over and over again. And sometimes they were referring to experiences of awe when they were pulled out of themselves, feeling a sense of vastness, sometimes a sense of wonder, and they use that as beauty. But we find that for physicists, beauty often means symmetry and simplicity. And so symmetry in the sense of the symmetry of theories and laws, so translation across space, translation across time, a law that is true here on Earth is also true on Mars, and those sorts of symmetries. And then simplicity in the sense that they want to reduce things to the fundamentals. There's a lot of drive towards developing a unified field theory, for instance, right? Trying to find a single model, or at least a model that would fit on a coffee mug or a T-shirt that explains all the fundamental forces of reality. So that's a lot of physicists find that beautiful. Biologists don't find those things beautiful. They really seem to gravitate towards complexity, and they want to understand a system in all of its intricacies. They want to understand how a particular mechanism is activated in some contexts and not in others. And so there's much more resistance actually towards simplification and wanting to understand things with adequate complexity. And there's also more of a preference for uh, visual beauty in biology. So the kinds of patterns that you see under the microscope, and seeing life unfold, and there's a lot of visual beauty there. And elegance means something different to biologists, it seems, than to physicists. A lot of physicists talk about the elegance of theories, whereas biologists talk about elegance in terms of experimental design. So those are the differences that we see largely, but there are also similarities, primarily in terms of the hidden order. That is, what are the sort of deeper structures of reality underlying the chaos that we see? What is the underlying pattern? So describing that hidden order, uncovering that hidden order, is equally beautiful to both physicists and biologists. And then the inner logic of systems, the causal mechanisms that drive these different structures, that explain how reality works, that's also equally beautiful to physicists and biologists.
Excellent. I noticed you said something interesting at the beginning of all that you study biologists and physicists, and they're usually on the other end of that. They're the studiers. At least that's probably how they see themselves. But it is fascinating. The same methodology gets used. Any decent study, whether it's biology or physics or sociology, you got to have the same pieces to it. And I'm saying this, by the way, because sometimes some of your scientific brethren don't give as much respect to sociology and psychology as they might. But they are deep disciplines all the same. And this notion of beauty has certainly been available to everybody as a lay person, as it were, not an expert in it, but they see it all the time. In fact, I just noticed the latest newsletter from Bitesize Bio came out, and I did not have any conversations with the editor about this. Something just showed up. The end of the newsletter is some paintings of somebody who's making paintings of electron microscope images, and to make them as scientifically accurate as possible. And of course, they're gorgeous.
Wow.
And you can't not be compelled by that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And some of the things you just mentioned too, like elegance as a mathematical concept, I think is beautiful. And it's I've mentioned that before, and some of the other things you've talked about, I've mentioned before in the podcast, because biology is made of chemistry, chemistry is made of physics, physics is made of math, math is made of magic.
Yeah.
But they all touch each other eventually, so so now, you mentioned at the beginning the name of your study did not have the word beauty in it. It was about wellness and well-being for scientists. So what's the connection there between beauty and well-being?
Yeah. So, I mean, part of the reason we chose that title was because we didn't want to bias the study only towards those scientists who cared about aesthetics and beauty. When we did some pilot testing before this study was launched, we found that physicists seemed to be taking it at disproportionately higher rates than biologists. They seem to really care about the topic. And there's some debate in physics actually about whether beauty is good or bad for scientific progress. So we decided to figure out a way to make this sort of potential selection bias go away. And we thought of well-being as being sort of a neutral and important area. There's a lot of research suggesting a looming mental health crisis, or even a a crisis in progress in the scientific community, particularly coming out of the UK. High rates of burnout and high rates of depression, particularly among postgraduate students and postdocs. So early career scientists seem to have a lot of mental health challenges these days, and partly it has to do with the precariousness of the job market, partly has to do with the pressures related to the sort of increasing emphasis on publish or perish and metrics for success and so forth, funding cuts, all sorts of factors institutionally that are affecting this. And so we really thought it's important to understand how scientists are doing. And we thought that I mean, it really was a question for us as to whether aesthetic experience, these kinds of encounters with beauty or experiences of awe and wonder, were related at all to well-being among scientists. So that was what we wanted to find out. We wanted to find out what beauty meant, and then sort of its distribution in the scientific population, the different types of beauty and so forth, but also its impact. And so we decided to focus on well-being as sort of the main theme of the study. And we did find actually that aesthetic experience is strongly associated with well-being. And so we have a couple of different measures of well-being we use for positive well-being, something called the Harvard Flourishing Index. And that's a global measure of things like life satisfaction, physical health, mental health, sense of purpose, close social relationships, and so on. And so on that count, scientists who encounter aesthetic experiences more and more often in their work, so feeling various, we didn't ask them directly about do you encounter beauty in your work. It wasn't just that. We gave them a number of things, like how frequently do you find yourself pleased by encountering symmetries in whether the equations or the objects you're studying, or how frequently do you find yourself being surprised by the discovery of a hidden order, or so we would break it down into those kinds of components. How often were you did you find yourself feeling a sense of gratitude for learning something new, or how often did you feel yourself pulled out of yourself, or feel a sense of vastness in the face of what you were studying? So we had a number of indicators of that sort. And so the more frequently they had those experiences, the better their overall well-being on this flourishing index, net of all kinds of controls for country, gender, discipline, even the effects of the pandemic. So it suggests that there's really a strong relationship between beauty and well-being.
Right. Yeah, I've heard a lot of words in there that relate back to other episodes we've done on Happy Scientists, because our objective is similar to what your study's objective was. We want people to be able to stay in science and build a career that's successful and that makes them feel fulfilled, and where they enjoy their lives. But there are those other parts of life that have to come into it. You don't ruin your health to make it as a scientist. You don't ruin your relationships to make it as a scientist, not if you want to do it properly. So tell us a little bit about the structure of the study. How did you choose who you interviewed? How many people did you interview? How did you conduct your data collection? How did that all work?
Yeah, so we had it's a mixed method study. We had a quantitative and qualitative component. And so for the quantitative part, we wanted the study to be as representative of the population of scientists as possible. And so what we did was we restricted ourselves to PhD granting institutions in these countries that we studied. So we studied 4 countries, the US, UK, Italy, and India. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One was these were a subset of a larger study that we'd done earlier, and these countries had the highest response rates in that previous study. So we thought there would be a higher chance of success. We also had established research networks in each of these countries. So we had a team on the ground. We had interesting differences in relation to, say, the R&D infrastructure that was dedicated towards, the proportion of the GDP of each of these countries dedicated towards science had some interesting differences, with the US and UK being the highest and then India being the lowest. And also some interesting differences in aesthetic cultures. So we were curious to know whether there might be some national differences because of the value of things like the arts across these countries. So we selected those countries, and then we restricted ourselves, as I said, to these PhD granting institutions, partly because that would allow us to get a sampling frame, which is a list of all the people we could sample from. And so we could guarantee that for PhD granting institutions, there would be enough information on the websites about all of the scientific members of the scientific communities in these organizations, right? So all the graduate students, postdocs, faculty, et cetera. And so we could scrape all those websites, compile a list, and then sample from that. And so in these countries, the vast amount of scientists, actually the largest proportion is from the US. So we had to stratify that sample. We couldn't take everybody, otherwise we'd end up just getting more US scientists. So we had to restrict ourselves to a smaller number of US scientists, and then we took the rest in the other countries without having to stratify. And so we got a list of about 22,000 scientists from this population, and we invited all of them to the survey. We got a completion rate of about 3,500 scientists, so that's 15% completion rate. We had a higher response rate. So the number of scientists who started the survey were about 6,000, something like that. But there were a lot of issues we came across. Some of the institutions blocked our study because they thought it was a scam. So we had a whole bunch of challenges. We tried to do everything we could to increase the response rate. We put out ads in Nature. We had a massive advisory board of really renowned scientists across all these countries. We had written to department chairs. We had a number of iPads raffled. We had every participant got a gift card in the amount of about $20. So we did a lot of things, but a lot of people were suspicious that academics get the scientists get a ton of emails, inviting you to like scammy conferences that aren't real, and so we did have a lot of queries saying, how do I know this is really a legitimate study? So a lot of people weren't convinced. So unfortunately, the best we could do was to get this 15% rate. And we were able to, fortunately, since we had the population parameters, we could correct for any selection bias, at least along the lines of country, discipline, to some extent gender, and position. So if we did have more Indian scientists compared to the proportion in the population who took our survey, and we had to weight them lower and then weight the US scientists higher, for instance. So we could do those kinds of corrections. So that was the survey. And then after the survey, we had these 3,500. We asked them if they wanted to participate in a follow-up in-depth interview, which would be about an hour to an hour and a half long, and that was done over Zoom. And we had about 1,000 scientists who agreed to be part of that. And so from that sample, we took about 200, and wanted some diversity across discipline, gender, and position, and so on. And we did some in-depth interviews as well.
Excellent. So I know you're making some apologies for the response rate and all that, but what really matters at the end, you had a solid pool to draw on. And for all the biologists out there, hear that? This is good stuff. And you may want to look into it more closely. So let me flip this around a little bit, because all this well-being, beauty sounds great. Is it always good for scientists to encounter beauty in their work?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are a couple of little challenges that we found in our work to that, and one of them has to do with beauty being a source of cognitive bias. And this seems to be the case primarily in theoretical physics, where there's been, for the last century or so, a lot of discussion around whether beautiful equations are a reliable guide to the truth or not. And it seems that for the first half of the 20th century, a lot of prominent scientists were insistent that if you just go with beauty, you'll turn out to be right. So people like Dirac, for instance, was very famous for stating that it is more important to have beauty in one's equations than for them to fit experiment, because your experiments could be wrong. But if your equations are elegant, and if there's beauty in them, you can probably count on experiments eventually validating them. There are others like Murray Gell-Mann, Werner Heisenberg, many of them who thought that beauty was a reliable guide to the truth. The challenge is after the 1960s, and particularly in the last few decades, a lot of physicists have been saying that, we relied on the beautiful math to invest a ton of money in things like the Large Hadron Collider and very expensive experiments that haven't really produced much new understanding. So the discovery of the Higgs boson, for instance, about 10 years ago, simply validated theories that were developed in the 60s, but they haven't really produced anything new. And that's the only real major discovery that's come from that. A lot of scientists are saying that some of these other kinds of beauty-driven theories, like supersymmetry and superstring theory and so on, um, there's really no empirical evidence for them, and it's not even clear how one would empirically assess those theories, right? So how do you assess like multiverses? Like how do you empirically validate that? So some scientists are arguing that this sort of beauty-driven science it's not science, it's fairy tale physics, or it's not even wrong. We don't even know what to call it, but it's closer to science fiction than to science. So that's one kind of complaint. Um, and the physicist Sabine Hassenfelder has particularly been vocal about this, and she wrote a really great book called Lost in Math for anyone who's interested in this topic. And the subtitle is How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. And we haven't heard any similar complaints among biologists. A lot of the biologists we talked to would say that beauty is it's good to have. I mean, it's a motivator. It draws you in to become a scientist, or it's important to have actually beauty as a heuristic or a guide in experimentation, because you don't want a messy experiment. You want your experiment to be designed in a way that's elegant. You don't want to communicate science in a way that's messy. You want to communicate in a way that's aesthetically pleasing. So, so that's, at least on the biology side, there seems to be less of a concern about this cognitive bias. Um, the other concern that's come up, though, is that uh, the insistence that science is about the pursuit of beauty could be used to exploit scientists. And so we've heard from a few of the scientists we studied that the expectation that you should love what you do, you should be glad that someone is even paying you to do what you ought to be pursuing as a hobby or just for the sake of love. Don't ask for promotions. Why are you why are you asking for more pay? And so women scientists in particular have told us that they've heard this narrative of science as a vocation, or science as something you should do for the sake of love, being used as a justification for denying them promotion or tenure, or paying junior faculty or even contingent faculty adequately. So that's a big problem. You don't want beauty to be used as a sort of tool for exploiting people. So that's the other kind of concern that we've seen.
Sure, and I think that concern applies to everything that isn't directly the science, everything
Mhm.
surrounding it. There- if you're getting a charge out of the fascination of intellectual endeavor, that can't be used as an excuse. Therefore, you shouldn't be paid, or shouldn't
Yeah.
be paid enough, or or you shouldn't have a good work environment. You know, these things should also be there. It's not so simple that this is merely a transaction. We pay you, you work. End of
Mhm.
story. I mean, that's no kind of life. It's no kind of career. So, and I love that there's another thing that, at least from my vantage point, is a new thing in the toolbox, adding beauty to the toolbox. So, we already talk a lot about well-being on the Happy Scientist, and Bite-Sized Bio behind that is really focused on helping people advance in their careers, and sometimes that's by learning how to do a Western blot, or
Mhm.
learning how to read your flow cytometry results. But
Yeah.
sometimes it's something more esoteric, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes that word even gets used as a pejorative. Esoteric
Mhm.
isn't bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's another world. And one of the things too that you brought up, and I like the fact that there are physicists and biologists in your study, because they really have some different strengths. And I've been reading several really interesting books of late that are coming from physicists that everybody should read. biologists, but everybody.
Mm.
Like Our Mathematical Universe by Max Tegmark, fantastic. Or another one. Oh, so I'm looking at my Kindle here. Oh, The Case Against Reality. What a great book. Yeah. And it's talking about the biology of why we perceive the world the way we do. And perceptions are how we find beauty. Now, some people will find beauty in those like electron microscope images. Some people will find beauty in things that aren't visual. Maybe it's sound. And you think about biologists that are studying animals, and they care about the sounds these animals make. And it's all part and parcel.
Yeah, one of the things we find though is that all of those forms of beauty, whether it's the visual beauty or other kinds of sensory beauty, or even the beauty that has to do with utility, right? So whether it's the use of a beautiful equation as a heuristic for truth, or the beauty that you build into your experimental design, all of those things are oriented towards something that we call the beauty of understanding. And so I recently interviewed, I have a podcast called Beauty at Work, and I recently interviewed a virologist who was telling me, when I look under the microscope, they're pretty images and so on, but that's not really that interesting to me. Where I really find beauty and what we talk about amongst ourselves as beautiful is the beauty of understanding. So all of those other forms of beauty, the sensory forms of beauty, are really valuable only in as much as they contribute to understanding, shedding new light on something. So that's where those themes of grasping the hidden order or inner logic of things really seem to resonate for most of the scientists. In fact, close to 80% of scientists said that was what beauty meant to them, either the hidden or discovering the hidden order or the inner logic of things. So we see that as the orienting force. In fact, we want to argue that science is a quest for the beauty of understanding. That's the business of science. That if you're not in that business, you're going to burn out. It's you're in it for other things. Maybe you're in it because it's a nice career, it's a comfortable job, etc. But then you may decide that there are other things that could meet those goals for you better. But primarily, those who seem to be committed to doing science, the vast majority of them say they're really in it to have that experience of the beauty of understanding.
Exactly. Well, we're all familiar with the concept of beauty. Truth is beauty, and beauty is truth.
Mm-hmm.
And these are high order descriptors. It's not so basic as that's pretty or that's attractive.
Yeah.
Beauty is something far deeper than that.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with pretty or attractive either,
Right. Yeah.
Serves a purpose, but
yeah.
So, this is some interesting stuff here. So I want to call out again. You just mentioned you have a podcast, and it's called
Beauty at Work.
Beauty at Work. So that might be one that you folks want to check out. It's funny in the podcast world. I find there's not really that much competition. It's easy to say listen to ours, but listen to his too. Because we want to get information in from all directions. Well, I say information more like data. It's data from all directions, which will then turn into information because we start to see connections between the data that we pick up in different places. And like this study, I wouldn't have looked for a study like yours out there. I wouldn't have thought it existed. So, your people reached out to us, and we do appreciate that because it fits well into what we're trying to accomplish here too. We want happy scientists out there. Well-being is going to matter to them. Every way they can get it, I want them to have it. And beauty always struck me. In fact, in between the time we first contacted and recording this, I immediately thought of a microscopist. I thought you guys got to talk.
Yeah.
This is he's constantly posting beautiful pictures on LinkedIn, and he's an interesting guy. But I knew you'd be an interesting guy too from our introductory conversations. But when else would we expect a sociologist to talk to a microscopist? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
you're not normally going to interact with each other. You're probably not even at the same conferences,
Oh, definitely not. Yeah.
Yeah. But, science is such a big world. And
Mm.
to people outside it, scientists are scientists, Every biologist knows chemistry, right? Not if you ask biologists. And it's funny how there's a hierarchy of some respect some things more than others, depending on where they started from.
Yeah.
But it all keeps branching out, and it all keeps crossing over. And this notion of elegance, I think, comes from mathematics originally. And I like what you said earlier, talking about how biologists have more of an interest in complexity. But there's a reason why life is complex.
Yeah.
And that complexity, you can't boil it down. Some stuff isn't that simple. There is a minimum reduction, and after that, it's just all protoplasm. The notion of life is a fascinating one. When you're studying chemistry, you don't see life necessarily, but when you study biology, you can't avoid it.
Yeah.
And of course, in sociology, it's all about life.
Right. Exactly.
So, all right. So now you've got a website for your study, which, by the way, is really, really nice website, folks. We'll post a link to that in the show notes so that you can get access to that. We'll post a link to your podcast there too, because we want to have as much outreach for you as possible. If somebody wanted to contact you, what would be their best way to go about it?
Yeah, they could easily contact me on my university email. So that's Brandon V, BRANDONV @cua.edu. There's also a form on my website, and you should be able to contact me through that. But yeah, happy to chat with anyone who's interested in our work. We have a lot of interviews actually with biologists on the podcast. Planning to do more, so we'd be delighted to learn more from people who are interested. We also have a forthcoming article in the Journal of Biosciences on beauty and biology that should be out sometime in the next few months.
All right, very good. Well, we'll post the links for your contacts on our show notes also, and of course you're on LinkedIn, so that's another place that Dr. Vaidyanathan can be found.
Yeah.
So what's coming up next? What are you going to do beyond this? What's the next step?
Yeah, I've been trying to look at the role of beauty in other domains of work, and my conversations with scientists suggested that a lot of these experiences aren't necessarily unique to science. So I've begun some initial explorations, and they're not very scientific. They're very journalistic. So I've done some YouTube videos, some short films with cocktail bar owners and chefs, and folks working in the nonprofit world, lawyers. Believe it or not, there's beauty in the law, and so I'm doing those sorts of conversations. I've been hosting a series of salon dinners, bringing people together from different backgrounds, scientists as well as others, to talk about what beauty means to them in the work that they do, which has been really a fascinating experience, because a lot of people find themselves reinvigorated by discovering aspects of their work that they didn't realize were motivating and worthwhile and meaningful. And so that's another sort of expanding project. The other sort of thing I've been trying to do is this sort of the concept of the beauty of understanding that we find. We really think that the world has something to learn from what the scientific community has to offer here. So one of the puzzles in our study was, when we set out to do this work, we thought that scientists might think that communicating the beauty of science would help build public trust in science, because particularly in fields like, when it comes to climate change and so on, there's a complaint that the way in which science is communicated tends to be very dogmatic, moralistic, kind of finger wagging. Listen to us, we're the experts, we know better. So we thought, maybe scientists would see beauty as a better way to communicate science in a more attractive way. But when we asked scientists this question in our interviews, a lot of them said no, that's really naive. Because people are going to come to whatever set of facts you bring them, no matter how beautiful, they're going to come to those facts with their own political priors. And so if your facts reinforce those priors, they'll be happy to support your science. And if your facts threaten those priors, then they'll reject you. And no matter how beautiful your science is, it's not going to come through. So it's a very old, actually, Hobbes made this argument some 350 years ago. And so scientists seem very Hobbesian, but we think it's not the beauty of facts, but rather the beauty of understanding. So that ability to grasp the inner logic of things, that it requires intellectual humility. It requires a willingness to be wrong, even a sense of delight in being wrong, because you can learn something new. So we're wondering, like, how do we harness that? And I mean, because we think that our polarized society needs to develop that sort of virtue. So we're trying to figure out how that can be done. We've been trying to bring together some scientists and science educators and science philanthropists. And so we're trying to have some conversations around that to see how this particular process that's cultivated in the scientific community, not perfectly, because science has its own internal politics and so on, but at least it's
I don't
taken
think
seriously.
that's going to be a surprise to any of the listeners.
Yeah. So we don't want to be naive about the problems in the scientific world, but at the very least, there's this idea that there's this ideal that isn't even there in the public, and so we want to figure out how do we expand that, make that happen, and yeah, more generally, I'm interested. I've applied for another grant to look at meaningfulness in scientific work more broadly, and so we'll see if that comes through. But yeah, there's some other projects down the road, and hopefully will come through.
Well, that next grant, I hope you get it, because that sounds like a really, really useful study.
I hope so too.
You mentioned humility earlier, and that's something that I have touted over and over again, especially to people that are highly educated and often very intelligent. Humility is so valuable. There's so much more to be gained. And when you're putting out into the world, if you put it out with humility, people are a lot more receptive. I understand the argument that has been made about people have their priors and they're going to just look for facts to support that. And we all do that to a certain extent. But I don't believe everybody does that all the time.
Yeah.
So we got to take advantage of those moments. So if beauty will help with that, fabulous. And it's going to make for happier scientists if they do that. Everybody wants to do their work and not be bothered, but they would also love for it to be appreciated. And especially if people are working in really erudite fields, really highly focused, it's hard for them to get appreciation from the outside world, because the outside world doesn't understand anything they do.
Yeah.
So learning to communicate not just among your peers, but with the wider world is also something that we really promote at the Happy Scientist, because it's going to make for a better career for you, and better day to day too. Because it's one thing, if your mother just like, oh well, no, my son, he's some big shot scientist, that great, that feels good, but you'd like them to have a little more understanding. Wouldn't it be great for mom to have a little more grasp what you're doing?
Yeah.
Now maybe your mother's a scientist too. I don't know, but I remember a time. I remember in 8th grade, I came home with my geometry homework, and my mother said to me, for the first time ever, "I can't help you with your homework. I don't understand it."
Yeah.
And that was when I was 13 years old. I see what it's like now for somebody who's now 23 or 24. Now they can't even talk to their favorite people in the world, and unless they're their friends in the same field. So every little thing that can make that easier, if you can go home and say, look at this beautiful thing I saw today. I remember going home. I'm a computer programmer from way back. I have a computer science background. I remember going home to tell my wife, I wrote this really great algorithm today. And fortunately, she was willing to sit through that and, okay, tell me about it. But she didn't understand, And finally, it's like, what? I'm just pestering you. I got to find a better way to tell you what I do. And So then it moved into, well, here's the impact. Here's
Mm.
why that's good. Why it's great that this is finished and being used, and it's made it into this product or into this service. Yeah. So the same thing happens in science. As
Yeah.
yeah. And people doing biology, and especially if they're doing basic research. And I say basic, I don't mean like simple. I mean
Right.
fundamental research
Yeah.
that people don't see it at the drugstore. People don't see it at the grocery store, but it impacts those areas. You know, it touches the world that we live in.
Mhm.
It's just it touched it several steps before we encounter it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think communicating the beauty of that kind of work is really important. I think learning how to, I mean, certainly for a lot of scientists, we find that, that sense of, wow, I experienced something beautiful is a motivator for teaching. It's a motivator for reproducing the scientific community, because you do want people who can appreciate exactly what you found beautiful, and you may not be able to share it with your spouse to that degree, but then also I think communicating to the public is really important, even if for very pragmatic reasons, which is if you want there to be more funding for basic science, it's important for the public to understand why that's valuable, even if there's not any kind of immediate utility. Who knows what the implications might be down the road? But then there's also look at the understanding we gain into how reality works, and that's
Right.
valuable for its own sake.
Right. Well, something you said earlier that kind of caught my ear was the notion that, oh, this, the Large Hadron Collider, all it's done is validate some past theories. So, but isn't that important? Validation is important. And we
Yeah.
talk about validation in the social world, oh, I want to be validated. Well, so do they.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there it's actually more valuable, because now we're validating that something is true. And a lot of validation in the social world is just, I validate that coming from your perspective, that probably looks right.
Yeah.
That's not so strong,
Yeah,
So,
it seems like it's a bit more of a question of like how much should we dedicate, right? I mean, I think that's where, with limited resources, how valuable are those insights? And I realize those are hotly disputed questions, but I think we
sure.
shouldn't we shouldn't neglect this kind of the fundamental research.
Well, yeah, definitely. And I think it is being supported, so that part's good.
Mhm.
It's not like, I mean, there have been times when like nothing could get support that was valuable. We're not really living in that world.
Yeah.
It 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 comes down to communication though too, and maybe it's just how you write your grant matters,
Mm.
and that's part of your career path, something you need to get good at. Great. That's true for a lot of scientists in a lot of different areas, and it crosses over. And we can learn from adjacent industries or adjacent disciplines. If you found something that's working, maybe a biologist can use it or a physicist can use it, and they could go in the other direction too. So, and in industry, there's plenty of things that have been already done in industry. They have been proven to work. That I'm sometimes amazed how naive some scientific organizations can be, even companies. The commercial side is like, oh, that's just commercial.
Yeah.
Just like you're just a sociologist. No, he's a PhD.
Right.
Get it straight. This is a deep discipline, and it's got high value, and we can learn from it. So, well, I will I will ask you now, is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I loved everything I heard today, so it was really useful. But maybe there's something I didn't think to ask you about. What do you have to say?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think we covered, a lot of the heart of the work we've done. So yeah, I would really welcome any feedback on this project. Any things that struck your listeners. I'd love to hear from you all. And yeah, any ideas for what how this might be either expanded or the use it might have for scientists. If more scientists would like to hear about this, we'd be happy to share our work.
Sure. Well, I love the application of Viktor Frankl to meaning in science.
Yeah,
Mankind's
yeah.
search for meaning is ongoing.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody, if you want to talk to Brandon, you'll have the contact information, and there'll be more to learn and listen to his podcast. Definitely look at the website. I think you'll find it quite fascinating. So on that note, we will sign off now on this episode of The Happy Scientist.
The Happy Scientist is brought to you by Bitesize Bio, your mentor in the lab. Bitesize Bio features thousands of articles and webinars contributed by hundreds of PhD scientists and scientific companies who freely offer their hard-won wisdom and solutions to the Bitesize Bio community.